The sun hung high in the cloudless sky over Oak Hill Heights, one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. Perfect lawns stretched out in every direction, broken only by carefully maintained flower beds and expensive cars parked in circular driveways. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, or at least pretended to. Officer Mike Reynolds drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his patrol car, trying to fight off the afternoon drowsiness that came with working a Sunday shift. His partner, Officer Steve Cooper, was scrolling through calls on their dispatch tablet, though they both knew this neighborhood rarely saw any real action. "Another riveting day in paradise," Reynolds muttered, adjusting his sunglasses as they cruised past yet another million-dollar home. Cooper just grunted in response, already thinking about the leftover pizza waiting for him at home. The monotony of their patrol was broken when they spotted someone walking down the sidewalk, a young black teenager wearing pristine white Air Jordans, designer track pants, and carrying what looked like a high-end backpack. The kid moved with confidence, like he belonged there, but something about the sight made both officers sit up straighter. "You ever seen that kid around here before?" Cooper asked, his voice carrying that particular tone that cops develop after years on the force, a mixture of suspicion and authority. Reynolds slowed the patrol car slightly, watching the teenager through his side mirror. "Nope. And I know most of the families in this area." He didn't mention that his knowledge mainly extended to the countless charity galas and community events where he'd served as security, rubbing elbows with the neighborhood's predominantly white residents. The teenager was walking with his head held high, occasionally glancing at his phone, completely unaware of the scrutiny he was under. His backpack looked expensive, one of those limited edition collaborations that cost more than some people's rent. "Something's not adding up," Cooper said, already reaching for the computer terminal. "When was the last break-in reported in this area?" Reynolds thought for a moment. "Couple weeks ago. Some kids from downtown were caught trying to case houses." He didn't add that those kids had turned out to be college students looking for their friend's house party. The patrol car's air conditioning hummed quietly as both officers watched the teenager through their windows. He had stopped now, seemingly typing something on his phone, completely oblivious to the attention he was attracting from behind the tinted windows of the police cruiser. "What do you think?" Cooper asked, though his tone suggested he'd already made up his mind. "Should we do our due diligence?" Reynolds nodded slowly, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "Better safe than sorry. These residents pay good money for their security, wouldn't want anything happening on our watch." The decision made, Reynolds eased his foot off the brake, letting the patrol car roll forward. Neither officer spoke as they approached, their minds already running through the familiar script they'd used countless times before. The teenager was still focused on his phone, unaware that his ordinary Sunday afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn. As they pulled alongside him, the teenager finally looked up. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the patrol car's window, and something flickered across the boy's face. A flash of recognition, not of them personally, but of what was about to happen. It was an expression both officers had seen before, but had learned to ignore. Reynolds reached for his door handle, the familiar click of it opening sounding unusually loud in the quiet neighborhood. Behind him, Cooper was already radioing in their location, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a routine stop. The sunlight caught the police car's emblem as Reynolds stepped out, casting a brief glare across the perfectly manicured lawn behind them. A few curtains in nearby windows twitched, the neighborhood watch already at work, though not in any official capacity. What happened next would change not just this Sunday afternoon, but the lives of everyone involved. The officers couldn't know it yet, but they were about to learn a lesson about assumptions and consequences that no amount of police training could have prepared them for. The teenager's heart skipped a beat as he heard the police car door open behind him. He'd been in the middle of texting his dad about picking up dinner later, but now his phone felt heavy in his hand. Taking a deep breath, he slipped it into his pocket, trying to keep his movements slow and deliberate, just like his father had taught him. "Afternoon, young man," Officer Reynolds called out, his boots scraping against the sidewalk as he approached. "Mind if we have a word with you?" It wasn't really a question. Officer Cooper had already circled around to the other side, effectively boxing the teenager in. The boy's expensive sneakers suddenly felt like they were made of lead as he turned to face the officers. "Is something wrong, sir?" he asked, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through his body. He'd practiced this scenario countless times with his father. Stay calm, be respectful, keep your hands visible. Reynolds sized up the teenager's designer clothes with obvious skepticism. "That's a pretty nice outfit you're wearing. Mind telling us where you got it?" "My father bought them for me, sir." The teenager's response was immediate, but Reynolds and Cooper exchanged knowing looks that made his stomach twist. "Your father, huh?" Cooper stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his belt. "And where does your father shop? These looks like they cost quite a bit." A couple walking their golden retriever crossed to the other side of the street, trying to appear casual about it. The teenager noticed, just as he noticed the faces peeking through nearby windows. His cheeks burned with embarrassment, but he kept his voice level. "Yes, sir. He bought them from the mall downtown. I can show you the receipts on my phone if you'd like." "Why don't you just set that backpack down first?" Reynolds suggested, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a suggestion. "Nice bag like that must have cost a pretty penny too." The teenager's fingers tightened on the straps of his backpack. "Sir, I live right here in this neighborhood. If you'll just let me." "The backpack," Cooper cut in, his voice harder now. "Put it down. Slowly." A car drove by, slowing down just enough for its passengers to gawk at the scene unfolding on the sidewalk. The teenager felt every pair of eyes like physical touches as he carefully lowered his backpack to the ground. "Now step back," Reynolds ordered, moving forward to grab the bag. "You say you live here. What's the address?" 1242 Oak Hill Drive, the teenager responded, watching helplessly as Reynolds unzipped his backpack. "My father is." "Sit down on the curb," Cooper interrupted, gesturing to the street. "Keep your hands where we can see them." The concrete was warm through his expensive track pants as the teenager lowered himself to the curb. His heart was pounding now, but his father's words echoed in his head. "Stay calm, son. No matter what happens, stay calm. Getting upset only makes things worse." Reynolds had started emptying the backpack onto the sidewalk. Each item that fell out was another piece of the teenager's dignity scattered on the ground: his calculus textbook, the laptop his father had given him for his birthday, his wallet with the family photos inside. Running checks on these items, Cooper spoke into his radio, reading off serial numbers from the laptop. The teenager wanted to explain that he had the receipt for that too, that everything he owned had been legally purchased, that he belonged here. But the words stuck in his throat as he watched his possessions being treated like evidence. His small leather folder tumbled out last, landing face down on the sidewalk. Reynolds kicked it aside without a second glance, focused on examining the laptop. The teenager watched the folder slide across the concrete, knowing exactly what was inside, knowing it would change everything. But for now, he remained silent, his father's lessons about patience and timing playing on repeat in his mind. More cars were slowing down now, more faces appearing in windows. The teenager could hear whispered conversations, could feel the judgment in their stares. He kept his eyes fixed on his shoes, the shoes his father had given him for getting straight A's last semester, and waited. The radio on Cooper's shoulder crackled. "Dispatch to Unit 247, running those serial numbers now." The teenager closed his eyes briefly, knowing what would come next. But before dispatch could respond, a different sound cut through the afternoon air: the distinctive rumble of a powerful engine approaching fast. Both officers looked up at the sound, their hands instinctively moving toward their belts. The teenager felt the corner of his mouth twitch slightly. He knew that engine sound. He'd grown up hearing it in their driveway. The black SUV was about to round the corner, and everything was about to change. The black SUV's engine growled as it rounded the corner, but neither officer paid it much attention. They were too busy rifling through the teenager's belongings, spread across the sidewalk like evidence at a crime scene. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the scattered textbooks, making the scene look like some twisted art installation about youth and authority. "Sir, please," the teenager spoke up again, his voice steady despite the situation. "If you just look at the ID in my wallet." "Did I say you could speak?" Officer Cooper snapped, his patience wearing thin. More neighbors had gathered now, watching from behind their perfectly trimmed hedges and bay windows. Some had their phones out, recording the scene from a safe distance. Officer Reynolds picked up the calculus textbook, flipping through its pages as if expecting to find something hidden inside. Advanced placement courses, huh? Where'd you steal this from? The teenager felt his chest tighten at the accusation, but he remembered his father's words. Your dignity isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you carry yourself in the face of that treatment. A woman walking her poodle hurried past, pulling her dog closer as if the teenager sitting on the curb might somehow be contagious. The sound of her heels clicking against the sidewalk seemed to echo in the tense atmosphere. Check this out, Cooper called to his partner, holding up the laptop. Brand new model. Must be worth at least $2,000. He turned to the teenager, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Let me guess, your father bought this too. The black SUV was getting closer now, its engine sound growing louder. The teenager could feel the vibration in the concrete beneath him, but he kept his eyes forward, his hands clearly visible on his knees. Reynolds was still going through the backpack, pulling out each item with barely concealed disdain. Designer clothes, expensive electronics, you expect us to believe all this is yours? In this neighborhood. The leather folder lay forgotten on the edge of the sidewalk, kicked aside earlier in their hasty search. A slight breeze ruffled its edges, threatening to reveal its contents, but neither officer noticed. Last chance, kid, Cooper pressed, looming over the teenager. Want to tell us where you really got all this stuff? Maybe we can work something out if you cooperate. The teenager took a deep breath, stealing a quick glance at the approaching SUV. Sir, I'm telling you the truth. I live here. My father. Your father again? Reynolds cut in, laughing without humor. Kid, do you know how many times we've had that story? Rich Daddy bought everything. He shook his head, picking up the wallet that had fallen from the backpack. Let's see who you really are. The black SUV was almost upon them now, its tinted windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. The teenager could see Officer Cooper's hand tensing on his belt, a reflexive response to the vehicle's approach. The leather folder on the sidewalk shifted slightly in the breeze, its corner catching the sunlight. Something gold glinted briefly, a badge perhaps. But Reynolds and Cooper were too focused on the wallet and laptop to notice. A small crowd had gathered now, maintaining what they considered a safe distance. Their whispers carried on the breeze, some concerned, some judgmental, none brave enough to intervene. Phone cameras recorded silently, capturing every moment of what was about to unfold. The SUV's brakes squealed slightly as it approached the scene. Both officers finally looked up at the sound, their expressions shifting from annoyance to confusion at the vehicle's obvious intent to stop. The teenager remained seated on the curb, his expensive sneakers scuffed from being forced to sit on the ground. But there was something different about his posture now, a slight straightening of his shoulders, a hint of what might have been relief in his eyes. The SUV's door opened before the vehicle had fully stopped. The sound it made seemed to cut through the afternoon air like a knife, silencing the whispers of the onlookers and freezing both officers in their tracks. That forgotten leather folder on the sidewalk held the key to everything that was about to happen. In just moments, Reynolds and Cooper would wish they'd paid more attention to it. But for now, they stood amid the scattered belongings of a teenager they'd wrongly judged, about to face the consequences of their assumptions. The SUV's door slammed with enough force to make the gathered crowd flinch. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his polished shoes crunching on the pavement. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, but it was his face that caught everyone's attention. A mask of barely contained fury that made the air feel electric. Officer Cooper's hand froze halfway to his radio as recognition dawned. Officer Reynolds nearly dropped the wallet he'd been searching. The teenager on the curb remained perfectly still, but the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth spoke volumes. Would either of you care to explain? The man's voice cut through the afternoon air like steel wrapped in velvet. Why my son is sitting on the curb like a common criminal? The word son seemed to echo across the perfectly manicured lawns. Several onlookers gasped, their phones still recording every moment. The man's shoes, identical to the ones the teenager was wearing, clicked against the sidewalk as he approached. "Okay, Captain," Reynolds stammered, his face draining of color. "We were just conducting a routine." "A routine what, Officer Reynolds?" The captain's voice remained deadly calm as he reached down to pick up the forgotten leather folder from the sidewalk. He flipped it open, revealing the gold badge and ID inside. A routine harassment of the Deputy Police Commissioner's son. Cooper's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The teenager finally stood up, brushing off his pants with deliberate care. The resemblance between father and son was striking now that they stood side by side. The same confident posture, the same intelligent eyes, the same quiet dignity. "Sir, we had no idea," Cooper began, but the captain cut him off with a raised hand. "Tell me something, Officer Cooper," the captain said, his voice carrying to the edges of the now silent crowd. "When you saw my son walking home from his advanced placement study group, what exactly made you decide he didn't belong here?" The question hung in the air like summer lightning. Neither officer could meet their superior's gaze. The teenager began quietly collecting his belongings from the sidewalk, each movement deliberate and controlled. "Was it perhaps," the captain continued, helping his son gather his scattered textbooks, "the same thing that made you assume his clothes must be stolen? The same thing that made you ignore his ID? The same thing that made you treat a minor with less respect than you'd show a stray dog?" A woman in the crowd lowered her phone, shame coloring her features as she realized her own role in this scene, standing by, recording, but never questioning why this was happening. "I want both of you in my office first thing tomorrow morning," the captain said, his voice now barely above a whisper, but somehow more commanding than if he'd shouted. "We're going to have a long discussion about profiling, about proper procedure, and about what it means to protect and serve all members of this community." The teenager zipped up his backpack, now restored to order. His father placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, a gesture of both protection and pride. The contrast between this touch and the rough handling he'd received minutes earlier wasn't lost on anyone watching. "Dad," the teenager said quietly, "can we stop for ice cream on the way home? All this sitting on curbs made me hungry." The hint of humor in his voice, the subtle dig at the officer's behavior, showed a maturity beyond his years. The captain's stern expression softened slightly as he looked at his son. "Ice cream sounds perfect." Then, turning back to his officers, the hardness returned to his eyes. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp, and gentlemen, bring your badges and your union representatives." As father and son walked back to the SUV, the crowd began to disperse, many of them unable to meet each other's eyes. The officers stood rooted to the spot, their earlier authority deflated like a punctured balloon. The teenager paused at the SUV's door, turning back to look at the officers one last time. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction at their downfall, just a quiet determination that suggested this wouldn't be the last time these officers saw him. But next time, it would be in a very different context. The SUV's engine roared to life, its sound now carrying a different meaning than when it had arrived. As it pulled away, leaving two stunned officers on the sidewalk, the afternoon sun caught the gold badge in the leather folder, still lying open where the captain had set it down. That badge represented everything these officers had forgotten about their duty: protect and serve, without prejudice or assumption. Tomorrow would bring consequences, but more importantly, it would bring change. Sometimes the best lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments, and this lesson was one these officers would never forget. The next morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. The police station buzzed with whispered conversations and sideways glances as Officers Reynolds and Cooper made their way to the captain's office. News had spread fast. It always did in situations like this. The walk down the hallway felt longer than usual. Their boots, normally confident against the polished floor, seemed to drag with each step. The morning sun streaming through the windows did nothing to warm the chill they both felt. 8 a.m. sharp, the captain's voice called out just as Reynolds raised his hand to knock. They entered to find not only the captain but also two representatives from Internal Affairs and their union rep, all seated around the conference table. The captain sat at the head of the table, his suit as impeccable as ever. A laptop was open in front of him, and both officers' hearts sank as they recognized what was playing on the screen: cell phone footage from yesterday's incident. "Sit down, gentlemen," the captain said, his voice carefully neutral. "We have a lot to discuss." The union rep shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the footage played. Every assumption, every dismissive comment, every moment of prejudice was captured in high definition. The morning light seemed to highlight every mistake, every breach of protocol, every violation of public trust. My son, the captain began, pausing the video, spent 3 hours last night explaining to me why I shouldn't fire you both on the spot. This revelation hung in the air like smoke. He said something that struck me, that firing you would be easy, but educating you could create real change. Cooper stared at his hands, unable to meet his superior's gaze. Reynolds found himself looking at the family photos on the captain's desk, pictures of father and son at graduations, award ceremonies, community events. The same boy they humiliated on the sidewalk, always smiling, always achieving. So here's what's going to happen, the captain continued, sliding 2 folders across the table. Inside you'll find your new assignments. For the next 3 months, you'll be working with our community outreach program. You'll be meeting the people you're supposed to protect, not just watching them through a patrol car window. The internal affairs officers exchanged glances as the captain outlined the program. It wasn't the punishment they'd expected, but maybe that was the point. You'll attend every community meeting, every youth program, every neighborhood watch gathering. You'll learn their names, their stories, their dreams. And most importantly, you'll learn why what happened yesterday wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal of everything that badge represents. The union rep relaxed slightly, recognizing that this was more than just punishment, it was an opportunity for redemption. Additionally, the captain's voice hardened slightly, you'll both be required to complete an extensive training program on racial bias and community policing. My son has actually offered to help develop part of the curriculum. He believes that personal experience can be the most powerful teacher. Reynolds felt his throat tighten at this. The teenager they'd profiled and humiliated was willing to help them learn and grow. The shame of it burned deeper than any official reprimand could. "Sir," Cooper spoke up, his voice rough with emotion, "your son, he showed more maturity yesterday than we did. More wisdom, too." The captain's expression softened slightly. He's been dealing with situations like this his whole life. The only difference is, yesterday he finally had the power to do something about it. The question is, what are you going to do with this opportunity? Both officers looked at the folders in front of them. Inside weren't just assignments, they were chances to repair what they'd broken, to rebuild trust they'd shattered, to become the kind of officers they'd sworn to be when they'd first pinned on their badges. "One more thing," the captain added, standing up. "Tomorrow afternoon, my son is giving a presentation to his advanced placement class about law enforcement and community relations. He's asked if you would attend, not to speak, just to listen. He thinks it might be educational for everyone involved." The invitation hit harder than any punishment could have. This teenager, who had every right to be angry, was instead offering them a chance to learn, to understand, to grow. "The footage from yesterday has already gone viral," one of the internal affairs officers noted. "People are angry, and they have every right to be. But how you respond to this, how you learn from it, that could make all the difference." As the morning sun climbed higher outside the windows, 2 officers sat in their captain's office, facing not just the consequences of their actions, but the opportunity those consequences presented. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but maybe that was the point. Real change, lasting change, never is. 3 months can change a lot. The summer heat had given way to autumn crispness, and the Oak Hill Heights neighborhood looked different now, not just because of the changing leaves, but because of how officers Reynolds and Cooper had learned to see it. They stood at the back of the community center's main room, watching as people filed in for the monthly neighborhood meeting. This time, they weren't here as security, they were here as part of the community. The same teenagers they might have once viewed with suspicion now greeted them with cautious nods of recognition. "Hard to believe it's been 3 months," Cooper muttered, adjusting his civilian clothes. They'd learned early on that uniforms sometimes created barriers they couldn't afford. Today was about breaking down walls, not building them. The captain's son stood at the podium, setting up his presentation. At 16, he carried himself with the confidence of someone twice his age. The projector behind him displayed the title of his speech, "Building Bridges: The Future of Community Policing." Reynolds watched as the young man arranged his notes, remembering that day 3 months ago. The memory still stung, but now it was mixed with something else, gratitude for the lesson it had taught them. "Good afternoon, everyone," the teenager began, his voice clear and strong. 3 months ago, an incident in our neighborhood went viral. Many of you probably saw the video. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. But today, I'm not here to talk about what went wrong. I'm here to talk about what went right afterward. The room fell silent. Even the usual whispers and shuffling ceased. The teenager clicked to his first slide, showing statistics about community policing programs. When officers make mistakes, he continued, we have two choices. We can push them away, or we can pull them closer. We can demand punishment, or we can create change. My father taught me that true leadership isn't about forcing people to follow rules, it's about helping them understand why the rules matter. In the audience, several people nodded. The captain, sitting in the front row, smiled proudly at his son. Over the past 3 months, Officers Reynolds and Cooper have attended every youth program, every community meeting, and every neighborhood event. They've learned our names, our stories, our dreams. And we've learned theirs too. The teenager clicked to the next slide, showing photos from various community events, the officers teaching kids about bicycle safety, helping at the local food bank, participating in neighborhood cleanup days. But more importantly, he continued, they've helped develop a new training program for our police department. A program that teaches officers not just how to patrol the community, but how to be part of it. Reynolds felt his chest tighten as photos from their training sessions appeared on screen. Images of difficult conversations, honest discussions, and gradual understanding. The teenager had been there for many of them, sharing his experiences and perspective with a maturity that still amazed them. Change isn't easy, the young man said, his voice softening. It requires admitting mistakes, facing uncomfortable truths, and being willing to learn. But when both sides are committed to understanding each other, remarkable things can happen. He clicked to a final slide, showing a recent photo of himself standing between Reynolds and Cooper at a community basketball game. All three were smiling, not the forced smiles of people posing for a camera, but the genuine grins of people who had found common ground. 3 months ago, I was just another teenager these officers saw as out of place in his own neighborhood. Today, they're part of a program that's becoming a model for departments across the state. That's not just change, that's progress. The applause that followed wasn't polite or obligatory, it was genuine, heartfelt. People turned in their seats to look at Reynolds and Cooper, not with judgment but with something approaching respect. After the presentation, as people mingled over coffee and cookies, the teenager approached the officers. He'd grown taller over the summer, or maybe he just carried himself differently now. Thank you, he said simply, for being willing to learn. Cooper cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. Thank you for being willing to teach. The captain joined them, placing a proud hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes, he said, looking at his officers, our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest growth. As the afternoon light filtered through the community center's windows, 4 people stood together, not as authority figures and civilians, not as officers and suspects, but as members of the same community. The path that had brought them here hadn't been easy, but maybe that's what made it worthwhile. Outside, autumn leaves danced across the same sidewalk where everything had changed 3 months ago. But now it wasn't just a sidewalk, it was a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes if we're brave enough to learn from them.